All right, we are now in the last of our sessions in this long day, for some of you very, very long, including Harald, who's over in Norway. So I very much appreciate you staying up so late with us. I'm going to say a few things about Harald that I didn't get to before, and then Harald will take over, and he'll, things are kind of like rolling downhill. He'll introduce everybody else. So Harald is a good friend and colleague of mine. We actually meet weekly to discuss our work with Stoicon, Stoicism Today, and various projects that we're working on having to do with ancient philosophy. He is a graduate student in philosophy at the University of Oslo. He has been the editor, I'm sure I'm going to mispronounce this, Philosoph supplement. Good, close enough. And member of the Modern Stoicism team, currently the assistant editor of Stoicism Today, but at the beginning of this new year, Harald is going to be taking over as editor as I transition and perhaps become, an advisor or something like that. So I'm really happy to have Harald here and all of these people who've got great new books out. I will say, too, that we didn't come up with the idea of doing this book panel on our own. We basically stole it from the Australians who have been doing this for a little while with their own Stoicon-x's, and I hope that it turns out to be a great discussion of some recent literature. We also have my co-editor of Stoicism Today, Volume 3 and 4 here, Leah Goldrick, to discuss it. So I'm going to turn this over to Harald, and he will be handling this. The one other thing I want to bring up before we get into it, we've had a great day so far with little rancor and conflict within the chat. Let's try to keep it that way, and go out on a great note.
Thank you, Greg, for that very generous introduction. So I have prepared a few questions, but if anybody in the audience have any questions, feel free to send them into the chat, and I'll try to forward them to the authors. I'd like to introduce Karen Duffy. She's a New York Times bestselling author, and her most recent book is Wise Up. We have Nancy Sherman here, and she's a professor of philosophy at Georgetown University. Her most recent book is Stoic Wisdom, Ancient Lessons for Modern Resilience. I hope that Kevin Vost is here, and he's the author of more than 24 books, including The Porch and the Cross. And his most recent book is Memorize the Stoics. Leah Goldrick is here. She holds a BA in philosophy and a master's in library and information science. Her website is Common Sense Ethics, and she is, as Greg mentioned, the co-editor of Stoicism Today, Selected Writings, Volume 3 and 4. David Fideler is a writer and a philosopher. He's the editor of the Stoic's Insights website, and his most recent book is Breakfast with Seneca. And finally, we have Donald Robertson. He's a cognitive behavioral psychotherapist, and he has written a lot of books about Stoicism, most recently the graphic novel Verissimus. So welcome to all of you.
Thank you.
Is there anything I forgot to mention in the introduction that you'd like to add?
I have one thing, and that is a thank you to the hosts and the organizers. So a great thank you to Greg, of course, Phil, Andy, Donald, I'm sure you're there somewhere. All of you. Thank you.
Thank you all, and thank you too for being here. It's great. So I think we can begin by asking each and everybody of you to say something about your most recent book. Maybe take a few minutes to talk about it. So, Karen, would you like to begin?
My new book is called Wise Up, and what was interesting, it's published by one of America's oldest feminist press, and it's a book about Stoicism, and they wouldn't allow me to use the word Stoicism, classic wisdom in any way. And I found it interesting that as a woman writing about Stoic philosophy in an epistolary form, I really was bumping up against a lot of obstacles. But then again, when are Stoics not faced with obstacles? And it's a great thrill because when you think about it, we only get 26 measly shapes in the English alphabet. But then when you line them up on a page, you create words, which can be more powerful than grenades. And so this puny allotment of symbols allows us to just dig deep and into our heart. So I believe that books are not just lifeless lumps of paper, they're minds alive on the shelf. And I work collaboratively with my amazing partner, Frances Gasparini. This is our 5th book together. And we were writing a book of essays. And after rereading Seneca's letters to a young Stoic, his letters to Lucilius and Nicomachean Ethics, we just really felt that this would work so much better and a lot more fun as a series of letters. So it was a great joy to write this. What I love about writing about classical wisdom is that essentially we have to read ancient books to kind of find new ideas, because in popular culture, ideas are just being recycled. So it's been a great joy to write this, and it is an honor to be here with these esteemed colleagues.
Thank you. Leah, would you like to go next?
Sure. As Greg mentioned, I am the co-editor of Stoicism Today's Selected Writings, Volume 3 and 4. And Volume 4 just launched on Friday. I have the proof here, the paperback proof. We'll be bringing the ebook out probably next week or the week after. And these projects have just been really great because, you know, books of essays really have something for everybody. And I give these books to my family and friends who are not Stoic because there's so many diverse topics in them that they can skip around and read what interests them. And I just think it's really great for people who are new to Stoicism, not that familiar with Stoicism, to learn that this is not just abstract hand waving, you know, that this philosophy can be applied to diverse topics in life and is very interesting. So, but I've been really grateful to be a part of the Stoicism Today project.
Thank you. Nancy, would you like to go next?
Sure. Thanks so much, Harald. Let's see. Stoic wisdom just wrote itself in many ways. And it, as Duff said about her work, it was a joy to write. Part of it was that I was pent up in a cocoon during the pandemic, and so feeling the isolation, but that's a sort of a mandate for writing without distraction. And I also felt that it, you know, at heart, I'm an Aristotelian, so the truth will come out. But that said, I found the Stoics had so much to say with regard to psychological mechanisms. One in particular of how really to press a bit of a pause button to impulsive emotions so that you have more trained and cultivated emotions. And also ideas of pressing a pause button so that you're not always as disappointed as you might be. I mean, we can't obviously anticipate everything, but we can prepare a little better than we sometimes do, or at least put a cushion between ourselves and potential disappointment. So I found it was wonderful. Also, you know, in thinking a little bit about Musonius Rufus and his remarks about women are at the table. They need to be at the table. They need to come to our lectures because we share in the same reason as others. And so that is a widening lens or aperture that I think is important for us to keep alive. So I look forward to the conversation and hope we get a chance to talk to each other and with each other.
Thank you. Donald, would you like to go next? I think you need to unmute. I think you need to unmute, Donald. There you go.
All right. So the book I'm working on at the moment is actually about Socrates, but I've just written 3 books in a row about Marcus Aurelius. And one of them is still in press. It's a biography of Marcus Aurelius for Yale University Press. And the one that's just come out recently, though, is a graphic novel called Verissimus. And that's a follow-up in a way to my preceding book, How to Think Like a Roman Emperor. So I wrote a self-help book about Marcus Aurelius, a graphic novel about him, and a prose biography of him. And the graphic novel, the one that came out recently, I guess like part of my motivation for doing that was over the years, I've met a lot of academics and psychotherapists, classicists and philosophers that are into Stoicism, and a lot of ordinary people that have just kind of stumbled across it. I've met a few people over the years that got into Stoicism not because they were into philosophy or self-help or therapy, but because they watched Gladiator. They watched Sword and Sandals epic and they thought it was kind of cool, or because they were just kind of into Roman history and things like that. And in some ways, I kind of find it particularly rewarding and speak to those people, because they may never have read a book on self-help otherwise, or a book on philosophy otherwise, but they maybe saw Richard Harris in Gladiator and kind of thought, I'll find out more about this Marcus Aurelius guy, and then stumbled across the meditation. So maybe their only exposure to self-help and philosophy and stuff like that. And so I wanted to write a kind of cinematic. I didn't realize this when I was doing Verissimus, but about halfway through, I realized that I was basically writing something that looks like a prequel to Gladiator. So it's the story of Marcus Aurelius's life and death in graphic novel form, and we decided to make it pretty cinematic in appearance and to put as much action in it as we could. But we also wanted to put as much philosophy in it as we could, and to make it as historically accurate as we could. So I consulted with many experts. I went to Carnuntum and shot a lot of video there where Marcus Aurelius was stationed during the Marcomannic Wars. And we kind of immersed ourselves in the subject, hoping that one day maybe the graphic novel that we made might end up as an animation or maybe even a movie or something like that. We've yet to see some more movies about Stoicism, because we've got one coming out shortly starring John Malkovich in a movie called On the Creation of Earthquakes, which is about Seneca and Nero. And Gladiator 2 is reputedly in the works as well. So, maybe in the future we'll see several more movies about Stoicism. So I wanted to make something that was kind of cinematic in nature and would appeal to a slightly different audience. And that's the book that I've published most recently.
Thank you. Kevin, would you like to go next?
Sure, I'd be happy to. And I want to say I'm honored to be here. I'm honored to have essays in those new selected writing volumes, I believe 3 and 4 coming out. But the most recent book I came out this year is called Memorize the Stoics, The Ancient Art of Memory Meets the Timeless Art of Living. And in my training as a psychologist, my specialty area was human memory. I did a master's thesis on how to teach adolescents memory strategies to help them learn academic material better. And my doctoral work was at an Alzheimer's center where I studied people with dementia and other brain disorders in normal elderly volunteers to see what happens to our memory and cognitive function as we age. But in this particular book, I should probably start by saying what it is. It is not. It is not primarily a book for how am I going to memorize great Stoic quotes word for word. I'll admit chapter 13 out of 15 does tell you how to do that if you want to. But the main theme here is kind of following something that Rob Coulter talked about, that process of digestion or pepsis. We're going to try to learn not quotable quotes, but how to keep in mind some fundamental Stoic concepts. We can put them in our own words, but so we have them in our minds and we can chew on them. So I do that in the first part of the book by using this specialized memory technique, the art of memory, the method of loci or locations, to go through all the 53 chapters of Epictetus's Enchiridion or handbook and show us how to place a mental image of each one of those in a particular place. So if we come up to the 9th place, this little cushioned bench in our memory tour, and we think, oh, here's where Yoda from Star Wars said to a hairy athlete next to him, pro hairy he is. We're going to remember, okay, in the 9th, Epictetus comes out and starts to drill into proheresis a bit. So basically, the book uses these ancient memory techniques that, like Stoicism, they have Greek and Roman origins. They come from Simonides in Greece, passed along by Cicero in Rome. But we're applying those techniques to the Stoic concepts themselves. And before I end, I'll say that some people have written that Seneca himself may have written a treatise on memory methods that we no longer have. We don't know if that's true or not, but we do know that his own father was a rhetorician and was himself a memory master. He wrote that he could repeat like 2,000 names of people and so forth. But anyway, this book, Memorize the Stoics, is kind of a spiritual exercise that encourages us and trains ourselves to try to really, learn some of the fundamental Stoic concepts kind of backwards and forwards and possibly even having a fun along the way, as we see that this is another way that our cognitive powers work. We can use this power of imagination to lock in important ideas.
That's great. Thank you. David, would you like to tell us about your book?
Yes, I suppose this is the moment where I'm supposed to hold up the cover so everyone can see it. So there it is, Breakfast with Seneca, Stoic Guide to the Art of Living. But the background to the book is that ever since I was quite young, in my early 20s, which was a very long time ago, I've studied ancient philosophy, and I studied Pythagoreanism and Platonism and Neoplatonism and things like that. And of course, I did read about the Stoics as well. But it was only about 15 years ago that I started reading Seneca, and it developed into a daily habit, which is where the title of the book comes from, because I developed this little ritual of reading one of Seneca's letters every morning at breakfast. And I wanted to write this book because Seneca, as a writer or as a Stoic philosopher, had been pretty much ignored by contemporary writers. And this is the first book that actually gives a synoptic overview of Seneca's main ideas that, the general reader would find to be interesting. And I like Seneca quite a lot, so I was very careful in doing the research. In fact, I took all of the chapter topics for the book, and I spent 4 months going through every single one of Seneca's writings and putting into a database everything that he said about all of these topics. So this huge database of quotations. Of course, the person who reads the book would never notice this at all because it's just like a smooth read, but there's a tremendous amount of research behind it. And then I went through Marcus Aurelius and Epictetus as well to see what they had to say about the same topics. And there's some really incredible overlaps between what they said. And that was how I basically organized all the material for the book, because I like Seneca and I couldn't psychologically bear the fact of misrepresenting his ideas. And so what I wanted to do is to produce a book that really explained Seneca's ideas, that was truly faithful to what he thought. And then in the end, of course, I had to explain what all of the Stoic ideas were about as well. So in retrospect, I think the book came out to be a very good general introduction to Stoicism too.
Great, thank you. Now I have a question for whoever who wants to weigh in. What did you learn about Stoicism in the process of working on your books? Karen, please go ahead.
Well, one of the things is a couple of my friends were like, how can you find like all the amusing things in Stoicism? I was like, because that's what I look for. And I was just in Athens with a colleague, Bethany Hughes, and she really pointed out how the Stoics, it's not just about living your life, it's about loving the living of your life. And I would say Epictetus, where, to simplify, if you make beautiful choices, you will make a beautiful life. That just reverberated through me like a cherry bomb in a cymbal factory. And that's the beauty of Stoicism, is that there's always something to illuminate and crack open your mind and think of it in a different way.
That's excellent. Thank you.
I guess,
Andy.
yeah, thanks so much. I have a sort of a reverse challenge, and that is, I find it very hard in some classes to get people to take Stoicism seriously. That is graduate students. Hate to say it, Donald, but they don't typically like Marcus Aurelius. They find Epictetus, too comic at times, Duff. There's too many epigrams. They want systematic Germanic philosophy. It's that audience. And so, I had a harder time convincing them that there was actually something really interesting in the idea of indifference that built on Aristotle's idea of external goods without necessarily taking away from it. Or that there were, as Chris said earlier in the day in his wonderful talk, that virtue and wisdom just is navigating in the world of indifference. It is trafficking in the mess out there. So the challenge of speaking to sometimes a little snooty graduate students who want analytic philosophy at all costs, or system building, it is a challenge. And I think it's good. The scholarship is so terrific out there, some of the deep scholarship, but also some of the scholarship that helps us make it more palatable when it isn't. So it was actually a challenge in a different way.
Yeah, that seems to have changed at my old university, or my university. So when I began, it seemed like if you want to specialize in ancient philosophy, you had to read Plato or Aristotle, and they didn't really take the Stoics all that seriously, it seemed. But that seems to change now, and so that's great. Anybody else? No. I'll have another question. What was the most difficult obstacle, if there was one, that you ran into in researching, writing, and publishing your book? David, perhaps you would like to begin?
Yes, let me talk about something else, which, because really, there weren't really any major obstacles, except for ones that I can't even tell you about, because they would be too political. I think it was something sort of like what Karen was talking about. But anyways, the most interesting thing that I discovered when undertaking this work is really how close Seneca, Epictetus, and Marcus Aurelius were. Now, Marcus Aurelius actually read Seneca when he was young, and he seemed to be quite enthusiastic about Seneca. But one of the things that I kept running across is how they were talking about the same ideas and things that you wouldn't necessarily expect. One of the really interesting things that I discovered is that all three of the Roman Stoics talk about gratitude, and that each one of them is expressing this exact same idea, that once you reach the end of your life, the mark of a life that has been lived well is that you'll be on your deathbed, and you'll be grateful to the universe for having given you the life that it has, and this opportunity to participate in the festival of life, to use that phrase from Epictetus, which he takes from the Pythagoreans, and just experience gratitude for all the things that you've been able to experience. And of course, the whole point of Stoic philosophy was eudaimonia, which I think is best translated as a life that's truly worth living. So having that kind of gratitude at the end of your life, I think, is a good indication that you did actually live a life that was worth living. One of the really interesting things that I had to think a lot about too in writing this book is because I really wanted to faithfully portray the ancient Stoic ideas, is that I really came to realize that even though the Stoics talk about God frequently, of course, as you know, the Stoics were pantheists and nature is God. So they didn't actually view God as a person in the way that theists would. So what I came to realize is that there's quite a big difference between pantheism and theism. So I tried to explore that concept in the book as well.
That's great.
If let me just add a footnote there, is that the thing that makes it interesting is that the Stoics have this idea of gratitude. And if you're a theist, theists believe that God created the universe and stands outside of the universe, and basically drew up a plan and brought the universe into being. So, and that God is a person. So that's the traditional view of the Abrahamic traditions, or the Judeo-Christian tradition. But Stoics can be grateful just to the universe itself, or have this gratitude for being. And so I found that to be a very fascinating topic to explore. And I really felt that that did expand my knowledge of Stoicism, being able to really look into that and think about that further.
Yeah, that's great. I really liked your section on gratitude in your book, where you quote Cicero, who said that gratitude is not only the greatest virtue, it is the mother of all the rest. So
yes.
Perhaps you can open up a general question for everybody on gratitude and how it fits in with the Stoic system.
Yeah, if I might just add a footnote, it's very strange actually that Stoic scholars have totally overlooked this topic, because Aldo Danucci, who's a friend of mine who was speaking earlier today from Brazil, he's the only person I was able to find who wrote an article on gratitude and Stoicism, but it's somewhat shocking to realize that it was so important to all of the Roman Stoics and no one has written about it.
I have something to add there. So I think Seneca on benefactions does talk quite a lot about gratitude and benefiting, or
he does. Yes, he does.
And
all of them do.
And he's fabulous because he brings to mind the reciprocation. It's like a game of catch. She says you gotta give the gift that's appropriate. A coat in the summer, is off. Books to a country bumpkin is the wrong thing. And you have to also show the gratitude, not with a furrowed brow, et cetera. So there's a lot of what I find probably the most exciting part of Stoicism is they're really prescient regarding the emotions. They get a bad rap about being emotionless or in denial about emotions. And, some of their prescriptions are like that, but their descriptive or theoretical account of emotions is well beyond most anything we have until we get to, contemporary periods. So
absolutely.
I think they're great, but others, we should open the conversation. Yeah.
Kevin.
Yes, if I can make a comment also about the theme of gratitude that David brought up and Nancy has added to. Some of my writing is about the work of Thomas Aquinas, a philosopher who is known for borrowing heavily from Aristotle, and then of course the church figures, St. Augustine and others who came before him. And in his Summa Theologica, he spends over 500 pages on what we call the four cardinal virtues. And he also addresses all these, what he called the parts of the virtues, what various philosophers have said tie into each one of those cardinal virtues. And I just recall that when Thomas does his question and articles on gratitude, he cites Seneca more than Aristotle, more than Augustine, more than anyone. So yeah, Seneca has absolutely beautiful writings on gratitude that some people through the ages have picked up on and recognized.
I think Cooper and Procope in their translations for Cambridge University Press a long time ago do a great job on in their notes and the rest.
Yeah. Here's another interesting question. It's from Scott Bennett, and it's for David, but you can all chip in. Do you have any thoughts on why Seneca is not mentioned in any of the Roman Stoic writings who came after him, who surely knew of him?
Yes, that's a difficult question. And one of the answers to that I came across is that Seneca went off basically in his own way, because Seneca was the only, I mean, aside, say, like from Cicero, he was the only Stoic. I mean, sometimes I think of Cicero as sort of like an honorary Stoic because he liked the Stoics so much, but Seneca was the only, full Stoic philosopher who tried to do philosophy in Latin. And so he was translating all these terms and things like that. And that never caught on, actually. Now, it was very important for the Renaissance because in the early Renaissance, which was a revival of Greek virtue ethics, the only philosophers they really had were Cicero and Seneca. So Seneca was extremely influential because they could read Latin. They couldn't read Greek until like the 1500s or the 1400s rather. But I think that Seneca was sort of like an outsider in the eyes of Marcus Aurelius and Epictetus, even though Marcus Aurelius liked him, because they were sort of purists who wanted to keep doing philosophy in by writing in Greek. And similarly, they don't mention Cicero either. So it just might be because they didn't think that you should do philosophy in Latin.
I'd like to add some comments to that. I've written a short biography of Seneca as an introduction to the capstone edition of Seneca's Letters a while back. And my view is Marcus Aurelius, first of all, we know had definitely read Seneca, because in his private letters, Fronto mentions that Marcus had been reading Seneca. And Fronto is scathingly critical of Seneca, although there's some ambiguity in the nature of his criticisms. It sounds like Marcus may have been siding with Seneca, but we can't really be sure. There is a passage in Cassius Dio where he says that those individuals who collaborated with Nero should have their names struck from history and never be mentioned again, except to point out that despite the fact that they sided with Nero in order to save their own lives, they ended up meeting the same fate as the Stoic martyrs that opposed him. And personally, reading that passage, I find it hard to imagine that it isn't alluding to Seneca. So I think it could be that Seneca's name was omitted from the writings of subsequent Stoics because of their concerns about his political affiliation with Nero.
That's always possible, but it's, all of these things are just speculations. We don't really know. And if you read Fronto's reference when he's talking about where he's criticizing Marcus Aurelius for reading Seneca, what he's actually saying, it's quite explicit. He says that he doesn't like Marcus Aurelius reading Seneca because of Seneca's flashy writing style, which actually is one of the things that's appealing to a lot of people about Seneca, because, he was writing in a different kind of style than the sort of like staid, golden age Latin style of Cicero. As far as Cassius Dio goes, I really think that people imagine that we know far much more about Seneca than we actually do, because first of all, I think it's quite obvious that Cassius Dio is just a totally unreliable source, and he was writing like around 150 years after Seneca died, and we don't really have any firsthand accounts of Seneca. So there were obviously some people that didn't like Seneca and tried to demonize him, but I think that we have to withhold judgment on that. But the most accurate source for Seneca's life is Seneca himself. And it's really funny too, because we know hardly anything about his life. He spent 10 years in Alexandria, and we don't know a single thing that he did there. So.
I think Seneca also, he's a problematic guy in that, it is hard to be in the court of Nero and have the wealth he has, and and wax on about being an ascetic and abstemious and woe be me, so hypocritical underplays a view. So you gotta, that's always in the mix there. What do you make of a guy like that? It's complicated.
The thing about Seneca, which is very interesting, I mean, look at the time that he lived. So he was a senator under Caligula, Claudius, and then Nero. And when he was called back to tutor Nero at the age of 11, he had no idea that Nero would turn out to be as bad as he did. The first 5 years were good, and then as things escalated and Nero became murderous, then, that's when things become interesting in terms of like Seneca's character and things like that. But, as various people have pointed out, the way that you morally make a moral judgment about someone is based on their intentions. And so if Seneca wanted to stay with Nero, to exert some kind of positive influence on him, then that would be perfectly, virtuous.
Right, thank you. Leah, there's a question from Greg Lopez. What went into your thought process for selecting topics for Stoicism Today compilation, the Stoicism Today compilation?
Well, Greg and I both chose some, but I think out of the ones that I chose, I wanted things that would be interesting and different from topics that I have read about before, and also apolitical, because I sometimes find personally sort of too much politics in a book about ancient philosophy to be off-putting, but maybe that's not true for everyone. But yeah, Kevin, I picked your Masonius Rufus diet piece. I was picturing that it was going to be about eating lentils and things of that nature, but really it's about, moderation with food and with, selecting what to eat. And it's a really interesting piece. And I also picked John Baptiste Roncarni, is it possible to escape time? I thought that was such an interesting topic. How can Stoicism, take us out of our normal mode of being, can take us outside of time. So yeah, that was just what went into my thought process for this most recent volume, that I wanted things that would be pretty different from topics that I read about before.
Great, thank you. And a question for all of you, and this is from Phil. What do you consider a success for a book? Karen, would you like to begin?
Yes, I think books, they don't get finished, they get published. You're always, changing and editing. And my partner, Francis Gaspardi, and I, we really don't connect it to numeracy or being on lists. We really feel like, how have we done as writers, and also, can we influence our readers? How do we move our readers? We often write about chronic pain. 80 million Americans live with chronic pain. That's an obstacle we have to face. So I feel success is absolutely small victories. And being on this panel.
Great to hear. Anybody want to jump in?
Yeah, I have 3 criteria for the success of the books that I write. That are interrelated, and one of them is writing is my full-time job now, that I earn enough money from it that I can afford to pay my rent. That's the first thing. Otherwise I'd probably quit and do something else instead. And the second one is that I learn something from the process of doing it. And the third one is that at least one person tells me that the book had a really big impact on their life and they got a lot of benefit from it. And I have those three criteria instead of a target regarding the number of books that are sold and things like that. It doesn't really matter to me how many people read my book or how many copies are sold. I'm quite happy as long as one person tells me it had a really big effect on them, and as long as I can continue writing more books in the future.
I think I have, that's all these comments are really helpful. Yeah, lists and numbers and your next contract really are very unreliable, unless you're a debut novelist, which I'm not, and most of us are not here. That said, I guess I have two. I have to want to really write it. If it doesn't, if it's not the topic I want to write on, it doesn't thrill me. I don't dance with the topic and get jazzed up about it, forget it. No one else is going to get jazzed up about it either. And so I have to read it, and it takes me a while to find what that topic is. That's one. It can't be a rewrite of the last book. That's really bad. That's so boring. And if you said it well the first time, you're not going to say it well the second time by just tweaking it a tiny bit. And then the third one is, those of us that are academics are trained to write a certain way to have to not have a career where you write, but you get paid as an academic. But to write where you can reach a wider audience while still being very faithful to the texts and research and scholarship that that's a challenge. And so I find I have, would my kids who are not academics but are bright, my husband, my mother, my parents, could they understand a chapter or two? That's often that has to work for me. So a kind of confluence. But the major one, do you want to wake up in the morning and start writing? And is it fun?
That's great. And there's a question from the audience that sort of builds on this. Lucas Long asked, how do you commit to a topic for a book when there are so many ideas to choose from?
Yeah, if I could jump in. I've written a lot of books over the years. My first one came out in 2006, which was another memory book called Memorize the Faith. And I remember right when I was finished, I'm like, okay, up next is Memorize Epictetus. I had this idea, I want to put this down on the page, but many other ideas popped up in between. So 20 some books, interfered, but there it was. But I know just one thing, maybe other authors can chime in. Sometimes if I'm actually seeking out an idea, nothing's coming, then all of a sudden I get an idea. It's like, well, of course, why hadn't I thought of this long ago? So I'm not sure exactly what muses are involved, but I always just enjoy it when what seems like the right idea comes out of wherever it comes out of. But I will say too, for me, the ultimate criteria of success, kind of like as Donald mentioned, if I have one person writing a review or one person who sends me an email that they've gotten something positive, something useful out of it, then it was worth all the time and effort to put it together.
That's great. So we got a question from the audience on, it's from Len Layton. Another question on the book marketing. Where in the bookstore do you think your books should be? Are Stoic's books stuck in self-help department with Dale Carnegie? I'm not sure who Dale Carnegie is.
Dale Carnegie. He wrote How to Win Friends and Influence People. There's an amazing book called The Oracle at the Supermarket, and it was a doctorate from the author who noted that the reason why self-help doesn't work is because the reward center of your brain lights up just for buying the book, not for actually adapting any of the practices or taking in any of the wisdom. So I think self-help and diet books should actually be in the entertainment section. And it guts me when I see my book in self-help, and I do bring mustaches and googly eyes and put it because I hate the cover so much. So that's how I had to overcome that obstacle. Is I go to bookstores I've got thousands of googly eyes and mustaches in my bag, and maybe I'll do it to yours too, Donald, if you'd like.
Yeah, that's great. So we're about to end now, and we have 5 more minutes. There's an after party afterwards, and if any of you want to stay on for longer, you're more than welcome to do so. But I think I'll end with another question for all of you. Do you think that there's some aspect of Stoicism that isn't talked about enough, both in academia and in the more popular books and blogs about Stoicism?
Yes, that's something I've been thinking about a lot recently. And I recently did a discussion with the Stoa app about what I call deep Stoicism. And I think that there has been a tendency to reduce Stoic philosophy to a series of life hacks and things like that. And I'm not being critical about those things because, you know, they can be incredibly useful. I mean, I use those techniques as well, but they have to be grounded in something deeper. And so what I consider to be deep Stoicism is like the idea of the cosmopolis, that we're one, you know, human family, and that we're also part of the cosmos itself. And also the importance of love in Stoicism, which Donald Robertson was actually the first person to talk about, and this idea of gratitude. Also, the fact is that the Stoics were incredibly positive about most of the different types of emotions. That's something that people totally get wrong, because for the Stoics, there were like 4 different groups of emotions, and only the pathe, or the passions, which were based, you know, on false opinions or judgments, were the ones that they considered to be negative. The other ones were either neutral or positive. So I just think that it's important for modern people not to lose sight of the deeper aspects of Stoicism. And I think that that's something that I enjoy writing about. And I know Donald Robertson does as well. And also Brittany Pollitt, I think she does a very good job with that.
Anybody want to follow up? Donald?
Sorry, I was muted there and I couldn't unmute. So Harald, could you just repeat the question for me again?
Yeah, so the question is, do you think that there's some aspect of Stoicism that isn't written about enough, either in academia or in the more popular blogs?
Yeah. All right, yeah, there are loads. From my personal perspective, the first book that I wrote in Stoicism, it's over a decade ago now. It's called The Philosophy of Cognitive Behavioral Therapy. And it was really my attempt to just kind of review the relationship between Stoic philosophy and cognitive behavioral therapy. And it seemed to me at that time that there was virtually zero, very, very little written about the relationship between Stoicism and modern psychotherapy. And some of the psychological ideas that we find in Stoicism are extremely important, extremely valuable, and probably have quite profound implications for our theoretical understanding of the philosophy. And some of them, I think, are never discussed in academic philosophical texts about Stoicism. There are concepts that seem recognizable to me, and I think would be recognizable to other psychotherapists, because they're similar to things that we do today that are, I think, almost universally overlooked. One of them, for example, would be the concept that we call cognitive distancing today, which is a kind of slightly thorny, kind of abstract concept. We have to use a jargon term to refer to it. But it's implicit in Epictetus's statement that it's not things that upset us, but rather our opinions about them. And that became a slogan of modern cognitive therapy. Cognitive therapists saw that as expressing the fundamental premise of modern cognitive approaches to psychotherapy. But what I think few people have really grasped is that really understanding that concept in itself produces a psychological shift that can have a very profound effect on our emotions, and also on our cognitive style. And I think the Stoics realized that. We can't be 100% for sure, but it looks to me like they really understood that. And it would have implications, I think, for their whole system of philosophy. Also, I think, as David alluded to, not enough is said about what the Stoics say about love. I mean, people think I'm crazy sometimes when I say this, but to me, Stoicism, in a sense, is a philosophy of love. It's about philostorgia, or natural affection, in a sense, and, you know, our relationship with the rest of mankind. And I think that's integral, and very little has been said about it. But I guess the flip side of that also is that more is said probably about the emotion of anger. But I think in modern texts and Stoicism, there are a lot more could be said specifically about the dangers of anger from a Stoic perspective, and the remedies for anger that we find particularly in Seneca, but also there's a list of 10 distinct remedies for anger that are listed by Marcus Aurelius in the Meditations, and they're not really explored in that much detail in many of the modern self-help books on the subject.
I think there's, I agree with exploration of positive emotions as well as the role of negative emotions. I think the Stoics are brilliant on emotions, frankly. And actually, I think Martha Nussbaum did a lot early on in talking about these in the academic sphere. I don't quite know where to go with this, but the Stoics wanted us to be able to use wisdom wisely, use knowledge and cognition wisely. We globally are failing in that dismally. We accept lies. We accept lies as inside jokes. We accept lies in order to promote power. And if the Stoics have any political currency right now, or at least help us not only save our world environmentally, as Chris was saying earlier, but save our world as humans who need to live in political arrangements, then we need to turn to ancient philosophy in part to value knowledge and value fidelity to the best ways in which we can use our senses to gather information, delight in our senses, as Aristotle would say, to gather information and to know, and to actually be knowers in truthful ways. So I don't have a text to point to you. It's not, or a verse. That's not the idea, but that certainly is the tradition of ancient philosophy. And so I think we need to return to that.
All right, thank you all. I think that will be the last word on this section. And we're going to bring in Greg and Phil now. Thank you so much for all your time and entry and for being here.